Welcome to Anthropology and Sustainability 353 online. Today and this week, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our discussion on industrial food production here in the U.S. And that will conclude the section of the course for industrial and post-industrial societies like our own. The next section of the course, which will start Thursday this week, is the third section of the course, which is sustainability across different cultures throughout time. So basically, how have other types of societies and cultures interacted with their environments? How have they managed their resources? And has it been sustainable or not? What can we learn from these various case studies cross-culturally? And we're going to start Thursday with a case study looking at complex farming societies, pre-industrial ones, the Maya specifically. And you're going to be reading two different articles about the Maya, which each sort of take a different side about what happened to them in terms of how they interacted with their environment. So we'll get there when we get there. Just to kind of recap where we left off, since it's been 2 weeks since we met, after the first exam, we got into industrial and post-industrial society, looking at increasing consumption and the rise of market societies and consumer culture. What are the implications of this consumption for the environment? We talked about the relationship between wealth and having more stuff and happiness. Is there really a relationship there? Watched the story of stuff, and then also discussed this related idea of individualization of responsibility. So the default frame for sustainability, for solving environmental problems, is always related to individuals. It always falls on the individual. Recycle, use less, reuse, reduce, get rid of your lawn, take shorter showers. And that's great. Individual actions do matter. But this glosses over the larger proportion of the problem. The focus on the individual is disproportionate. They are disproportionately emphasized when the majority of the problem are these larger organizational and structural barriers to sustainability. By organizational and structural, I mean the way the system's set up through economic policy. For example, the fact that 80% of water in California goes to agriculture. Most of that water is also subsidized, meaning farmers don't actually pay for it, tax dollars pay for it. This incentivizes use and even waste. And so these larger organizational issues, the argument goes, need to be addressed if we actually want to solve environmental problems. This brings us right into industrial food production. Individuals can try to be as green as they want. It won't solve our problems if we don't address the majority of the problem, these structural barriers. Don't forget, also much of what we talk about today in wrapping up industrial food is also covered in the Poland readings and Bodley. And so in the US, we have a tendency to reduce food down to the parts, the protein, the fat, the carbs. This is just recapping sort of where we left off before face-to-face classes ended. What are we eating? And what are your choices? Are they your choices? In what way are they shaped or limited? Do we eat a variety of different foods? Poland, remember, calls us corn koalas because koala bears eat one thing, eucalyptus leaves. He says humans are essentially the same. We eat one thing, corn, even if it is disguised as a myriad of different products on the shelves. It's really a handful of ingredients controlled by a handful of companies that go into the 40,000 products in the grocery store. So if you want to understand what you're eating, we need to think beyond the plate, beyond the nutrient facts and label, and actually analyze the food system. Get away from the nutrient list. If you want to know what you're eating, look at the food system. So just a couple of quick examples I don't think we ever got a chance to discuss in class. Food for thought. First, did you ever wonder why in the US we put our eggs in the refrigerator? I didn't know that in other countries, people don't do this. I was in New Zealand several years ago and the eggs were sitting out, and I asked why. What do you mean, why aren't they in the refrigerator? They never have been. We just leave them on the shelf. So finally one day I looked into it back here in the US, and the US, in contrast to other countries, puts their eggs in the refrigerator because of the way we produce them. So remember from the film, Food Inc. We raise chickens in these crowded conditions where they are raised quickly on corn and antibiotics. Because they're sitting in their own feces, we feed them antibiotics to keep bacterial infections in check. The result, again, from that is we often get super bacterial strains of E. coli that cause other problems. And so the FDA in the US requires farmers or food producers to bathe the eggs in either chlorine or bleach. Sorry, I always forget which. You can look it up. FDA requires us to bathe eggs in chemicals in order to kill any bacteria that might be sitting on the outside of the shell. Because they're bathed in these chemicals, it weakens the shell, which is a naturally made barrier to keep toxins and other poisons out. So in the US, we put our eggs in the fridge to keep the growth of bacteria, if there is any still on the outside of the shell, to keep that bacterial growth arrested. So because once it does start to grow, it can easily cross through the shell, through the weakened barrier because of the chemically soaked shell. In other countries, they don't raise their chickens like this, so their eggs aren't covered in really dangerous bacteria and feces, and so there is no regulation in other areas to bathe the eggs in chemicals to kill the bacteria, which in effect weakens the shell that actually lets the bacteria in, which is why we keep them in the fridge. Industrial food production in the US, they don't do it this way everywhere. One other example, my dad is always talking about how he eats antibiotic-free chicken from Tyson, I'm pretty sure. So I looked into that one day. The reason why Tyson chicken is antibiotic-free is because instead of giving the chickens antibiotics to kill the bacteria, they simply spray the meat with chlorine in order to kill the bacteria. So antibiotic-free chicken. And the best part is the chlorine doesn't even kill the bacteria. It just lowers the levels down low enough to be below FDA requirements. There was a big story that came out a year or so ago, an article about Brexit, before Brexit had sort of gone through, or if they knew it was going to or not. People in Britain were concerned that if Brexit went through and Britain was no longer part of the European Union, which has really strict food regulations, that Britain would get more imports from the US for food. And one of the things they were worried about being imported from the US was the US's chlorinated chicken, right? i.e. sort of antibiotic-free chicken. So anyways, just a side note, this is how we make our food here. And one other note, antibiotic free, right? It sounds good. It catches our eye. My dad thinks he's doing a good thing when he buys that chicken for his health. Be careful of these health claims, right? They might not mean much at all. And so just to give you an idea of how things have changed in the past century, how things came to be the way they are today. In the 1920s, back when George Naylor's grandfather was on the farm, about a quarter of Americans worked in agriculture. The average farm produced 20 bushels per acre. This is about the same yield that Native Americans got on that land prior. U.S. farms were diverse. They had different crops and animals: cattle, chicken, corn, wheat, hay, oats, potatoes. You could feed the people living on the farm as well as the animals on the farm, and additionally sell products coming off the farm. Farms at this time were more resilient as well. They were diversified. If one crop collapsed because of climatic fluctuations, that's okay. They could rely on others they were growing. If the price went down on the market, that's okay. The farmer had other crops to sell on the market to rely on. And at this time, we spent about 22% of our income on food. That's in 1949. So this is the myth. that the industry is interested in perpetuating. You see this on packaging in the stores all the time. Farmer John, farmer this, the family farm, producing fresh, healthy food for you. And this is the reality. It's not a small family farm producing fresh food. It's a factory, right? A monocropping paradigm that has massive outputs of a few commodity crops. Industrial farming, oh, excuse me, let me just back up. The US food system today, compared to the 20s, only about 1.5% of the population works in agriculture. Since the 1960s, the number of farms has declined from 3.2 million to 1.9 million. Remember, it was over 6 million in the 1920s. But at the same time, the average size has increased by 40%, and productivity, how much food's coming off the land, by 82%. So what you're seeing is there's less and less farms, but they're bigger and they're producing a lot more per acre. Most of them just raise single commodities, namely corn and soybeans. And so what we think of normal farming today as in the industrial age is based off monocropping, growing one crop that is produced for sale in the market. And how did this come about? Why this change? It's a result of two key changes. One, fertilizer, and two, the invention of hybrid seeds and later GMOs, genetically modified organisms. The result is an enormous boost in yield, but not without consequences. So first, in terms of fertilizer, there was a huge turning point. And again, I realize we discussed this before class ended, but since it's been 2 weeks and it's relevant to the rest of the material, I thought we would recap. And it will probably pop up on quizzes, maybe exams. So one of the great innovations that allowed for industrial farming to come about happened at the end of World War II in 1947, when a munitions plant, basically a wartime machine made for making ammunition, switched over to making chemical fertilizer. And so during the war effort, large amounts of ammonia were being made as a precursor to munitions. And nitrogen is a limiting factor in the production of ammonia. So, excuse me, during World War I, the Allies had had access to large amounts of nitrate deposits in Chile. So they had all their raw materials. The British pretty much owned them at the time. Germany, however, lacked access to natural deposits for nitrogen or nitrate. And so Haber, a German Jew, came up with the Haber-Bosch process. Basically, Haber created it, and some other guy named Bosch came along and popularized it and attached his name to it. And essentially what this allowed Haber to do was turn thin air into fertilizer. So nitrogen is a critical limiting agent in plant growth. So is oxygen and carbon, but plants can easily absorb these from the soil and the air. Air is 78% nitrogen, but atmospheric nitrogen is nutritionally unavailable because nitrogen molecules are held together by strong triple bonds. And so nitrogen has to be fixed, that's the term for it, fixed into some bioavailable form through natural or man-made processes. Previously, prior to the Haber-Bosch process, there were only natural processes for fixing nitrogen into the soil, which is what creates and adds to the fertility of it so you can grow plants. Excuse me. So these two processes, one is there's a bacteria that grows naturally on the roots of legume, bean plants. And as part of the life cycle of this bacteria, it trades the plant for a little drop of sugar that it ingests, and the byproduct from the bacteria is a little molecule of nitrogen that gets fixed back into the soil. And so normally in diversified ecosystems, soil fertility is maintained. There's a sort of natural balance maintained. There's multiple different plants and animals decomposing, adding nutrients to the soil. When we farm, when we monocrop and we continually plant the same acreage to the same exact species like corn or soy again and again and again, it continually depletes the soil, pulls all the nitrogen and other resources out of it without really putting any back in. The fields are never left fallow. And so the Haber-Bosch process essentially freed us from the constraints of natural soil fertility by figuring out how to synthesize nitrogen out of thin air, allowing it to be fixed into a bioavailable form for plants to take up. The other way that nitrogen can be fixed naturally is lightning. So not a main source of nitrogen fixation. Lightning bolts can break apart the strong triple bonds that hold nitrogen together in the air and rain down a little light patterning of fertility, if you will. And so fixing of nitrogen via the Haber-Bosch process allowed farming to now be based off fossil fuel rather than the sun, right? Again, we were freed from the constraints of naturally produced fertility. We have fossil fuels, this vast reserve, this vast energy source we can draw upon. It's probably the most important invention of the 20th century. It sustains about 40% of the global population. More than half of the fertilizer applied in the United States and around the world is nitrogen. And about 1% of the world's energy supply, like fossil fuels that we burn fossil fuels, 1% of that energy supply is used just via the Haber-Bosch process to fix nitrogen into fertilizer. The invention of fertilizer in combination with the invention of hybrid seeds is what allowed for the current farming situation, this huge boost in yield. So hybrids are crops that are selected for certain traits and then pollinated in the lab. It's somewhat similar to artificial selection, it is artificial selection. So in natural selection, there's genetic variation within a species, within a population. And certain individuals within that population may have certain traits, sharper teeth, they can run faster, they're camouflaged, whatever it is, certain traits that give them a survival and reproductive advantage in their environment. These traits will allow these individuals to survive and reproduce in higher numbers, thus passing those genes on to future generations. Eventually, the population can come to take on different characteristics, and over really long periods of time, possibly speciate into new species. And so artificial selection is similar to natural selection, except instead of nature or the environment filtering out and selecting for the traits, humans do it. And so they select for the traits they want and then breed these plants until those traits become more prevalent. Most of the scientific research around the creation of hybrid seeds for farming occurred at public universities. It was considered a public good, public knowledge. It wasn't something that was patented or sold. And the key trait that was selected for was yield, higher yield specifically. High yield hybrid seed came on the market in the 1930s. And what you can do with it is, let's take corn, you can plant it close together. It was bred for two things, thicker stalks and also stronger root systems. If you plant non-hybrid varieties close together, they'll stretch out for sunlight as they grow and compete with one another for resources and eventually topple over one another, knock each other down. With hybrid corn, every single plant is a clone. It's an exact genetic clone. So no one plant has an advantage, grows higher than the other. Again, bred for stronger root systems and thicker stalks, you can plant them super close together and they'll all grow straight up. So that where you could plant maybe 8,000 plants on an acre in the 1920s, you can plant 30,000 plants on an acre now. Poland calls it a true socialist utopia. And it's this combination of fertilizer with hybrid seeds that's known as the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution as a term is sort of an oxymoron. It refers to this explosion in our ability to produce food, large yields. The consequences, though, are not so green. So this shows total world production of coarse grain from 1961 to 2004, the Source Food Agricultural Organization. And if you look at the blue and the red lines, the top lines, it shows that we are producing way more food. Yield is up, production is up. The bottom two lines, area harvested and seed, hasn't really increased, maybe even declined a little bit. So we're growing way more food on the exact same amount or even less land. This has certain advantages. We can feed a lot more people. We can produce a lot more cheap commodity crops. The question of who benefits from that we'll get to at the end of this talk. Big gains, but also big problems. First of all, environmental issues. Industrial agriculture is really polluting and wasteful. Enormous amounts of chemical and fossil fuel inputs from industrial farming contribute to environmental degradation. One great example of that is runoff from fertilizer in the fields. This increases nitrogen in our freshwater and our groundwater tables. And so Poland talks about this example of something called blue baby alerts in Des Moines, Iowa. During the spring, when the runoff from agricultural fields is highest, the city of Des Moines actually issues something called blue baby alerts, warning parents not to give their children water from the tap because it's been, excuse me, contaminated with fertilizer runoff. And there's so much nitrogen in the water that the nitrates actually bind to the hemoglobin in the body and compromises the body's ability to carry oxygen around the brain. And younger children and babies can't handle it. They'll literally turn blue and suffocate. So we have a city in our country that has an official policy called a blue baby alert to warn not to give your babies tap water during a certain time of the season because of the way that we farm and the chemicals that we dump onto our environments. Another consequence of nitrogen runoff, fertilizer runoff, is hypoxic or dead zones in water. The Gulf of Mexico, for example, pictured on the slide, shows a dead zone the size of New Jersey. So what happens is, in these hypoxic zones, fertilizer nitrogen runoff accumulates in the fresh water and runs downstream, eventually entering out into the Gulf, the ocean. Nitrogen, as well as other minerals and nutrients, are again critical limiting agents in plant growth, including the growth of algae. And so what happens is the freshwater and the Gulf becomes eutrophied. There's a rush of plant nutrients in the form of nitrogen, and it causes a complete bloom and explosion in the algae population. The effect of this is it chokes out all the oxygen in the marine environment and kills literally everything else in that ecosystem. So good for the algae, maybe from that standpoint, but not for most anything else in the ecosystem. Another thing about industrial agriculture is it's extremely wasteful in terms of resource use and pollution. More than 1 calorie of fossil fuels, and we're talking about kilocalories, synonymous with food calories here, just a measure of energy use. 1 calorie of fossil fuels is used to produce, or excuse me, more than 1 calorie is needed to produce just 1 calorie of food. This is because not necessarily human energy inputs, but all the non-human energy inputs, the fossil fuels, the fertilizer that goes into the farming. Before we started using synthetic fertilizers, for every energy invested in food production, you got at least 2 calories back, right? In the tribal world, small scale societies, for every calorie invested in producing food, you got about 10 calories back. So our system's extremely inefficient relative to other societies throughout time and space. Poland also talks about something called the wet mill. This is where This is where corn basically goes to die and live on in all the products that we put it in. It's where corn goes to get processed. Each calorie produced in processing uses at least 10 calories of fossil fuels burned. On top of that, it takes about 1 bushel, or for 1 bushel of corn, it takes about half a gallon of oil and 5 gallons of water, just in growing and milling it, respectively. That's not to mention transporting and cooking and all the other things we do with it. The rise of industrial agriculture also had social consequences, one of which is it has destroyed the small farm. So as corn production increased, and we're talking sort of post-World War II, the price of corn declined. The only way for farmers to maintain their livelihoods when this happens is to produce more corn. So the way this works is if you flood the market with any sort of commodity or item, you create more supply, but there's not an increased demand. The result is the price falls, right? You have to offer your surplus of corn or whatever it is you're selling for less in order to stay competitive on the market because so many people grew corn that year. So many people are trying to sell it. There's not enough demand. It drives the price down as people compete to try to get you to buy their corn at a lower price. So to stay whole, you're selling corn at a lower price, you have to sell more of it. This drives production up. We also needed less people to grow just corn and soybeans. Small farms essentially disappeared. You don't need warm bodies. You don't need humans to do it. Farming communities have become depopulated. Michael Pollan gives examples in the small towns he visits in Iowa. One example where it takes 4 high schools to create just one football team. The closest store with edible food is a 30-minute drive from some of these farms. And the food that's being grown on the farms now, you can't eat most of it. It's this hybrid corn that will break your teeth if you bite into it off the stalk. It has to be processed into animal feed or processed food before we can actually ingest it. Remember, growing corn is just riding tractors and spraying. And so there's no jobs, there's no employment out here anymore. Another effect is that all this cheap corn has made it profitable to fatten cows and chicken livestock with corn instead of grass or other feed that they naturally would eat. So farmers that are still raising cows and chicken on their natural feed could no longer sell their livestock. They couldn't compete with the cheap cows and chickens being sold on the cheap corn-fed diets. Grass-fed cows can't really compete with these large CAFOs, these concentrated feeding operations that we have. Industrial agriculture has also not helped the farmer in general. How many of you have heard of the Farm Bill? How many of you could explain what it is? Right, probably most of us can't. How convenient that it's confusing for us. Most of us don't know about it, don't really understand it, and therefore don't typically try to change it. The Farm Bill is key to why industrial agriculture in our country works the way that it does. So U.S. policies currently have pushed the price of grains like corn and soy down. This has not helped the farmer. How does all this work? So initially, out of the Depression era, the Farm Bill, government farm policies, came out of this time. The goal was to limit production and support prices for farmers. Now that's been reversed over time. The Farm Bill essentially incentivizes increased production, which drives the price down. So what does that mean? How does this work? And it can be kind of tricky. Pollan talks about it in The Farm, that first reading from Omnivore's Dilemma, and I'll do my best to distill it here for you as well. You might want to take some notes. So initially, the Farm Bill came out of the Depression era, and not to encourage farmers to produce more food, but to keep them from going out of business from overproduction. During times, years, harvests, when a certain crop is overproduced, this collapses prices on the market, right? Because too many farmers have produced, let's just say corn, too much corn. They're all trying to sell it on the market. To be competitive, they try to offer it at a lower price, and this drives the price down. Crop surpluses collapse prices and therefore bankrupt farmers often. So if some farmers won't make it, they won't be able to continue with this livelihood. They'll switch livelihoods. Then during lean growing years, we won't have enough farmers to produce enough food for us. So the Farm Bill was designed again to limit production so that market prices don't collapse and that farmers can stay in business either way. This is how it worked. For storable commodities like corn, the government in the Farm Bill established a target price based off the cost of production. So a target price they would pay the farmer, which takes into account how much it costs to grow the corn, how much of a profit you need to make to stay in business, etc. If during this year, the market price, what the farmer would be able to get for his corn on the market price dropped below the target price established by the government, the farmer was given a choice. Instead of dumping the corn onto this weak market where there's already too much corn, which would then further lower the prices, leaving farmers worse off, pushing some of them out of business because they're not getting enough of a return on their investment because the prices are so low, the farmer had a choice. They could take out a loan, monetary loan from the government, based off the target price, and then give the government their corn as collateral. The government can store this in a granary. Then you can wait and see if market prices recover. So if market prices recover later on, say a month or two down the road, and it's now more worthwhile, more profitable for the farmer to sell the corn on the market, the farmer can do that. The farmer can take the corn back from the government, pay back the loan, and sell their product on the market for more money. All good. If the market price never rebounds, it stays low, then the farmer can elect to keep the money, keep the loan, which again is based sort of off how much it costs them to make the corn, how much they need to stay whole and stay in business. Farmer can keep the loan and let the government keep the corn, which the government can use for other things, trade, and as we'll come to find out, providing very cheap raw materials for our major food producing groups like Tyson and ADM and Cargill. So this worked pretty well up until about the 1970s when other powerful elites in the government, namely the secretaries of agriculture under different presidents, started playing a role in shaping the Farm Bill. And so one thing that there's a lot of different things that sort of connect to come together that accumulate into where we are now. One of the things that happened in the 60s is in order to help Nixon get reelected, the Secretary of Agriculture at the time sold a bunch of grain to Russia. And this created huge profits for the US economy. And that's one thing politicians like to tout when the economy is doing well, when they're trying to get support or reelected. So it made the economy look really good, at least in terms of GNP and the stock market. Whether or not those benefits were distributed more widely is another question. But the sale to Russia, which resulted in a boost to the US economy, also created a food shortage here, which reverberated into the prices in the grocery stores. Food prices got really high. And so this pissed people off, and the goal then became, within the Farm Bill, to increase output and drive down prices. At least that was why they said they were doing it. Get big or get out. And so the big change, the key change that happens in the Farm Bill, that changed things from sort of working, suppressing overproduction, keeping farmers whole, to the situation we're in now of overproduction and low prices. The key change is when the government switched from giving farmers loans to direct payments. And so the farmers now are encouraged to basically sell their corn at any price directly to the government because each bushel that they grow, the more bushels per acre they produce, they're going to get cash money, an exact payment for each bushel, again, that they produce. And so it changes the incentives. The incentive now for many is grow, grow, grow because I'm guaranteed a profit based off how much I produce. There's no longer the sort of hedging your bets, wait to see what the market will do. The market might rebound and maybe you'll sell your corn at a higher price, although the target price the government set has gone down every single year since the Farm Bill was established, pushing prices down. So the farmer could maybe wait for the market price to go back up, but that's not going to happen because policy actually structures it so that it won't. Or the farmer can go for the sure bet, grow as much as possible, knowing they're going to get a return for each bushel they produce from the money the government's going to pay them in direct payments. So again, it can be kind of confusing. Feel free to jump on the Blackboard discussion board and ask questions or seek clarification about any of this because it is confusing and complicated. Again, the big change was from loans to direct payments. It changes the incentives. The farmer no longer really waits to see what the market will do. The goal becomes produce as much as possible because I'm going to get paid per unit of production. And as prices continue to fall below the cost of production because the target price keeps getting lower, farmers have basically one option if they want to stay in business. They have to grow more corn. The price keeps going down. To stay afloat, you have to grow even more corn each year. This situation of overproduction keeps the price going down, which keeps the farmers producing more and more. And so about 5 billion a year is spent subsidizing just corn, just paying farmers to produce corn. Barely keeps the farmers afloat, but results in huge, huge profits for these major food producing companies like Coca-Cola and Cargill. Um, Again, the system is structured now to incentivize overproduction, which keeps prices low. The farmer has one choice if they want to stay in business, grow more. And as the price continues to drop each year, they have to continue to produce and sell more each year. The government then uses our tax money to pay the target price to the farmers for the cost of production. And so who really benefits? Not the farmer. The consumers get cheap prices, but the food's not good for our health or our society or our environment or much else. Who really benefits? It's these large companies, these large food producing groups that can buy 4 cents of corn because it's subsidized, because the government sells it for almost nothing because they paid for it with our tax dollars, can sell 4 cents of corn and turn that, or buy 4 cents of corn and turn that into a $4 box of cereal. Huge, huge profits being made off of this system that really benefits sort of a handful of stakeholders, not the majority of society or the farmer. And politicians like you to think the Farm Bill is all about the small farmer. It's really not. Again, 5 billion a year spent subsidizing corn. And last year in 2019, because of the trade war that started between Trump and China, essentially Trump slapped tariffs on Chinese imports. Just to clarify, which is a tax put on imported goods, Chinese imported goods, that consumers in the US then pay if they buy those goods. It's supposed to keep domestic goods competitive with foreign imports. So in a trade war that began between the Trump administration and China, Trump slapped tariffs on Chinese imports. Well, China responded in kind. They tapped us right back. And you know what we produce a shitload of that China buys a ton of? Soy. And so China stopped buying soy from us just to bail out our farmers from the trade war that was started between China and Trump last year, 2019. $16 billion just to bail farmers out because of that one situation. Again, the government's really subsidizing the food corporations, not the farmer. And federal payments, subsidies, amount to about half of the income of all Iowa farmers. And again, it's not the small farmer. The subsidy amount is based off the size and production level of the farm. So it's these huge mega farms that are getting most of the subsidies. And since the 1950s, the policy has been go big or get out. Small farmers have basically been driven out of the process. They can't produce enough to stay competitive with the low price they have to sell their corn for. Ezra Benson, Secretary of Agriculture for Eisenhower, get big or get out. Earl Butz under Nixon, adapt or die. By 1970, the battle was pretty much over. Another problem with industrial ag is farming is not like running a factory. And so typically in industrial production, you can create as much supply as you want in order to meet demand. So the cheaper you make something or the cooler you make something, it should technically enable you to sell more of it, increase the demand. Farming doesn't quite work like that. There's some constraints to it that make it not like a factory. First of all, with farming, there's ecological parameters. Um, Climatic fluctuations, pests, locusts, droughts, things like this that create unpredictability in how much yield, how much product you're going to get off your field. Technology has allowed us to largely mitigate this, move around this. Fertilizer, genetically modified seed. This has allowed us to basically mitigate these environmental constraints, get around them. Another way that the farm is not like a factory is demand is inelastic. Our demand for food is inelastic. We all need food, but at the same time, there's only so much of it we can eat per year. And so technically, again, the cheaper you make something, it should allow you to sell more of it. But with food, no matter how cheap it gets, we can only eat so much of it. Poland talks about the industry strategies around this fixed stomach and inelastic demand. He talks about a few different things. One is added value. This idea, the added value is when companies enrich the food, enriched flour, they add nutrients, they add convenience, health, packaging, marketing, uh, perhaps something on there that says they're contributing to environmental causes. They turn their food product into a commodity. Right? They add value to it. Because if one farmer's selling apples and another farmer's selling apples, it's all just apples. Nothing really makes them different. So how do you differentiate your product from other people's products in order to sell more of yours? Add value, right? Add nutrients, add health, or at least the illusion of that, right, to the consumer. One of the funny things about added nutrients and enriched flour, the reason for that is because in the processing, in the wet mill, they break the food down and take all the nutrients out. And so they then add the nutrients back in because they're stripped out during processing. So more like added back in nutrients. Another way that Poland talks about is food scientists have actually figured out how to tease out of corn a molecule that can pass right through human digestive systems without actually us consuming any calories from it. So truly food that we can eat and it won't fill us up. It'll run right through us. There's all these other techniques too that we talked about, like supersizing large portions, adding high fructose corn syrup to all our food, pressing those evolutionary buttons, those cravings for salty, fatty, sugary foods, the fact that humans will eat 30% more if presented with large portions. The industry knows this and they use it. Student sent me this a few years ago, shortly after we'd been talking about Poland's concept of added value. What are we doing? Nature, it's an orange. Nature already made a peel for it that actually protects it, keeps lots of the toxins and poisons that could otherwise get into it out. So what do? We remove the natural peel, we put it in plastic, which will go into the dump, and we sell you oranges with added value, right? This is the added value that Poland's talking about. Sell health, sell convenience, sell status, identity, any added value that turns potatoes or corn or water into distinguishable commodities. Or this one, my TA sent me a year or so ago. Um, Same idea. How do I distinguish my food from yours? Added value, protection, safety, convenience. So US policy, and specifically the Farm Bill, has meant junk food is really cheap in our country, and fruits and vegetables, the healthy foods, are relatively more expensive. One of the most recent farm bills, which we sort of redo it about every 5 years, there was 26 billion in direct payments. The vast majority of it, of these subsidies, going to the largest farms. It's not the small farmer that's getting monetary assistance through subsidies, right? These subsidies have become perverse. And again, it's the biggest beneficiaries are the food processors and the meat producers that can fatten their cattle on cheap corn or turn 4 cents of corn into a $4 box of cereal. Why? Why is a Twinkie, which goes through so many different steps, is made up of mysterious ingredients that get fermented and crushed and pulled apart and put back together to make this snack cake? All these steps, not to mention the packaging, the transportation, the marketing, the buying it at the store, the consuming it, all these steps, when an apple you sort of plant and pick and eat. Why is a Twinkie 15 cents and an apple is $1.25? It goes back to the Farm Bill, right? Again, the farm lobby likes to pretend the small farmer benefits, but that's not true. The subsidies are given based off the level of production. It's the mega farms that are getting most of the money. And the way that the system is structured, it makes the unhealthy food cheap and the healthy food relatively more expensive. This is just to show you farm acreage in the US, 268 million acres planted. This is the source of our food. We also export and import some food. It doesn't change the basic picture. And remember, all food is ultimately plant-based. Animals are simply intermediaries. So in order for them to grow and provide products for us, whether that be milk or meat, they have to first consume plants. And because of trophic levels, about 90% of the energy gained through that plant material to grow the animal is lost. Only about 10% of that energy is converted into edible products for humans. So it's really, really consumptive. And look at the point of the graph is to show you how much acreage is devoted to just 3 different categories: grains, oil seeds, and hay, sort of the cheap commodity crops that are used for animal feed or processed foods. Only 1.1% of our farmland is used for growing vegetables and fruits. And just to add to what I said on the last slide, about 1% of our food is dedicated to growing fruits and vegetables, most of it to commodity crops. We in the US feed roughly 39 million cows or calves a year. Feed and raise 39 million cows a year for slaughter, for human consumption products. You could probably feed 500 million people with that. Population problem. And so we have a paradox in our food system. Worldwide, nearly 1 billion people are undernourished, facing some form of malnutrition or not enough food. These are usually the people that are rural and dependent on agriculture, like the villagers we saw in the Legacy of Malthus film in India. And paradoxically, another 1 billion people globally are obese. It cuts across class lines. And so obesity can fall on all sides of the social ladder, but poorer people in rich countries tend to be relatively more obese compared to well-off people. And that's because it's the unhealthy food that's cheaper. If you're low income, if you have a limited amount of money to spend, what are you going to choose to fill yourself up and your family? $1 gets you 1,200 calories of chips, but only 250 calories of carrots. Right? $1 will get you 200 calories of fruit juice, but 900 calories of soda. And so if you have limited money, limited resources, and you and your family need to eat, it's not really much of a choice, right? There are a lot of health problems with the current food system. In 2012, there were more than 1.46 billion overweight adults, and at least 500 million of them were obese. This is from the World Health Organization. In Japan, about 1 in every 20 adult women is obese, compared to 1 in 4 in Jordan, and 1 in 3 in the US and Mexico, and up to 7 in 10 in Tonga. Do we need more food production? Do we have a population problem? Monocropping and the Green Revolution, the way we do farming and what we think of as farming today, has lots of social and environmental problems. And so, just to sort of recap some of those. First of all, groundwater contamination through nitrogen runoff, chemicals, fertilizers, and other pesticides and herbicides that we use on our plants, that has to go somewhere. A lot of farmers will use 2 times as much fertilizer as recommended as they need, just to sort of play it safe. Well, if the plants don't absorb that nitrogen, it has to go somewhere. It goes into the soil, into the groundwater table, into these hypoxic zones the size of New Jersey and the Gulf of Mexico. Industrial farming also causes a huge increase in the release of greenhouse gases, atmospheric nitrogen, methane from animal agriculture, but also just CO2 from electricity and other energy inputs we're using in our machinery, in our production of fertilizer, etc. Monocropping also results in a loss of crop diversity. It makes ecosystems less resilient and more vulnerable to climate and pest fluctuations. The way you can sort of think of that is, well, to take the COVID virus, for example, one reason it's such a concern for public health is the coronavirus is a novel virus, meaning humans have never been exposed to it before. It's evolved, it's new. On that note, it's thought to be a zoonotic disease, meaning it probably jumped from animals to humans, possibly in a market in Wuhan. This has happened throughout human history, zoonotic diseases, but it wasn't until we had large sedentary populations, such as with the agricultural revolution and especially the industrial revolution, where we crowded people into these dense urban areas. It wasn't until then that these zoonotic diseases could turn into widespread epidemics or plagues or pandemics. Okay, and so one of the reasons it's such a concern is because no one in the human population has immunity to it, and so we're all vulnerable to it. Same thing in a ecosystem. Ecosystems are naturally diverse and resilient, and there's multiple species with overlapping ecological niches to fertilize the soil, to recycle waste, etc. And so if a climate shift comes along or a locust swarm comes along, parts of the ecosystem, in the naturally diversified ecosystem, parts will be vulnerable, but other parts will not. When you simplify the ecosystem and you're growing just 1 or 2 species, now that entire population in that field is vulnerable to whatever climatic or pest fluctuation might come along. And so that's one of the problems with monocropping as well. Also, eutrophication, a nutrient explosion via fertilizer runoff of our lakes, our streams, and our coastal marine ecosystems, creating these hypoxic dead zones, destroying entire ecosystems. Social consequences. Employment opportunities are down in rural areas. You can't really get a job. It's all riding tractors and spraying. You don't need human labor to do it the way that we do it here in the US in industrial ag. Also, local diets are reduced. You can't eat most of the food coming off the farm. Closest store to some of these places is a half-hour away. The policy as it stands benefits larger, richer farmers, these mega farm corporations, and has impoverished many at the same time. And we've exported the Green Revolution to much of the rest of the world. Can we feed the world without destroying it? And what food scientists and others sometimes argue is that, well, we need fertilizer, we need these technologies to produce enough food to feed everyone. So is that true? Can we feed the world without destroying it? Are there alternatives to what we're doing? And we'll get into some shortly. In the 1960s, and really all you want to know about this, I just wanted to point out, it was in the 1960s, we exported our economic development, our new technology for industrial farming, the green revolution, fertilizer and hybrid seed to the rest of the world as part of economic aid and development projects. And instead of growing things that naturally grew in these areas, for example, we'll look at a case study after the break in Bali, Indonesia, where they exported the green revolution to. And instead of growing the local varieties of rice that naturally grow really well in that environment in Bali, they had everyone switch over to these high yielding GMOs, these hybrid seeds, varieties of wheat, rice, corn, i.e., maize, that not only require you to buy the seed, but also need chemical fertilizers and herbicides to survive. They also urged farmers in these other regions of the world where they exported the green revolution to consolidate, to get big, to centralize so that they can produce more, make more profits, create more economic development, and that will trickle down and benefit the country as a whole. So the theory goes. Surpluses and profit margins were proportional to the size of the farm. So the bigger the farm, the more viable. Those that consolidated did okay. This means that the majority of farmers, that small farmers, lost their viability. And again, the key selling point for why we got people to adopt the Green Revolution. We'll give you money, we'll give you aid, and institute the Green Revolution to grow your economy so you can pay us back and increase livelihood and well-being in your own country. The idea was to generate rural prosperity by having people grow these uh, marketable commodities and not just grow enough to eat, but also enough to export, right, for profit. Make farmers into business people, create wealth in this way. It was a major problem with tons of longstanding, still relevant consequences today. Again, we'll look at a case study next after the break from Bali, Indonesia, where we exported the Green Revolution. Not only did it not work economically for the people, but it has essentially destroyed their ecosystem, which is part of a World Heritage Site, actually. It's so beautiful. We'll talk about that next week. One of the justifications for exporting the Green Revolution to other places is this can help solve the world hunger problem. This info comes from Stone, an article about fallacies in the wars over using GMOs, genetically modified organisms, to solve the hunger problem. And the data, some of the data from the article shows that in 2002, India actually had 41.2 million excess tons of grain. Um, is that a problem of too many people and not enough food, or maybe people don't have access to that food? For example, India has a surplus of grain, but 250 million people are malnourished, and 1.5 million children die from malnourishment. Is this a Malthusian dilemma, or something else going on? Right? We have a distribution problem, an access problem. Hunger has rarely been associated with overall food shortages. Poverty, lack of access to the resources we need to survive. This is a social condition, and that's what creates hunger and famine. And so, just like the Green Revolution has been touted as a solution to the population, the world hunger problem, this is also used to advocate for the use of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And so GMOs, the pictured here is the glowfish. It's a patented type of zebrafish, comes in different colors. And it was the first genetically modified animal to become publicly available as a pet. And so just to define for you genetically modified organisms, it's an organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering techniques. One of the main techniques is called recombinant DNA technology. And so you use DNA molecules from different sources, other species or individuals, and then combine that into one molecule to create a new set of genes. The DNA is then transferred into the organism, which gives it a modified gene set. And so GMOs are now the constituents of many of our foods. There's two sides to the argument. One side says they're good, GMOs can solve world hunger and have all these other benefits. The con side questions that and says, really, GMOs are just about profit. Um, and I'll explain why in a moment. And so, first of all, before getting into the two sides to the story, GMOs do not necessarily need to be dangerous or problematic. We actually already eat them all the time. Most of the plants that we eat and animals are domesticated, meaning they've already been through this process of domestication, sort of passive artificial selection via humans. Uh, and so we already eat genetically modified foods. Our ancestors, as they picked and selected certain crops to plant and regrow, selected for certain traits, and those are present now in the foods we eat today. So it's not so much GMOs are dangerous because they're genetically modified, it's why and how they're created and used that's potentially dangerous or a problem. So the pro side, why GMOs can save the world. And the people that sort of argue this side are the CEO of Monsanto, the food scientists. They play the Malthus card, right? And so they say GMOs can help solve world hunger. You can breed these seeds for all different types of abilities like drought tolerance. You can make them herbicide resistant, which reduces the need for herbicides. Also, by making them herbicide resistant, it kills the weeds without harming the crop, so you don't have to weed. This creates less soil erosion. You can breed them for insect resistance. And so examples are sort of Monsanto videos. We can save the world from world hunger. And so the example I have for you is golden rice. Golden rice is a genetically engineered crop, and it was engineered to biosynthesize beta carotene, which is basically an important precursor to vitamin A. So golden rice was suggested, it produces up to 23 times the amount of beta carotene, which produces vitamin A, as regular rice, the original variety of golden rice. So it could be used in areas where there's vitamin A deficiency, right? This sort of supplement that's naturally built into the crop. That's sort of the pro case. The critics, those that say GMOs are not needed to save the world and may pose serious dangers, sort of environmental activists, social activists. They would say there's potential ecosystem dangers presented by GMOs. There hasn't been that much research. There could be unintended consequences. If we breed seeds to be pesticide and herbicide resistant, you can spray as much as you want into the environment. That has implications for the environment. Also, loss of biodiversity. GMOs might outcompete other species in the natural ecosystem. Furthermore, by monocropping, you're inherently simplifying the ecosystem, making it less resilient. There's health risks potentially. Again, not a lot of research has been done. And critics would also point out that there's a profit motive for GMOs. One motivation for creating them is that people can then patent them as their own intellectual property. So if people want to grow those plants, they have to buy the seed from, say, Monsanto or whatever company selling it. That's kind of a scary thought because if, for example, a company came to have a patent on all the different seed varieties, people would not be allowed to grow that seed without first purchasing it from a company. The example I have for you of the critics case is the terminator gene. So the terminator gene is a specific genetic sequence inserted into a seed's DNA. Once activated by a synthetic chemical catalyst of the manufacturer's choosing, the sequence renders the seed and crop it produces sterile. It's patented by the USDA and Delta and Pine Land Co., which are now owned by Monsanto. This terminator technology has no agricultural or economic benefits for farmers or consumers. The only motivation is to protect intellectual property rights according to owners of the technology. They claim it allows them to be able to recover investments on research and produce profits from their technology, as planters must repurchase seeds every year. Opponents claim corporations will only use this to squeeze more money out of dependent farmers and begin a monopoly of chemically saturated suicide seeds. So I have a real world example for you of genetically modified seeds, modified to be herbicide resistant, Roundup Ready cotton. And the main ingredient in Roundup, glyphosate, is linked to causing cancer. It's pretty much been proven. Monsanto's actually in several court cases right now. They've lost a few of them for several $100 million for causing cancer among individuals that use their products that they told them that they were safe. And so Monsanto developed in 1974, you can see on the slide, Roundup brand agricultural herbicides continue to be a perfect fit with the vision of sustainable agriculture and environmental protection. They don't really go on to say how, but you can feel comfortable using them because they say they're sustainable. So cotton was genetically modified to resist Roundup, this weed killer. The gene that creates this resistance was discovered, cloned, and then transferred into plants like soybeans and corn that we grow as crops. Genetically modified crops have become the norm in the U.S. About 90% or more of our acreage for corn, soy, and cotton is all planted to GMOs, herbicide-resistant GMOs. So Roundup Ready cotton was introduced 20, maybe 30 years ago. With miraculous results. So the way it worked is you plant your cotton, you spray your Roundup all over it. It kills all the weeds, but it doesn't touch your cotton. Then a sort of super weed evolved, pigweed, Palmer amaranth. And pigweed ended up becoming resistant to Roundup. So the Roundup would no longer kill this particular weed when you sprayed it over the cotton ready Roundup crop. But pigweed's a real problem for cotton. Pigweed grows 3 inches a day, and a single plant can release close to 1 million seeds. It's a bully. If you let it grow beside cotton, cotton doesn't stand a chance. And you can sort of see that in the picture, the pigweed growing over the rows of cotton. And so this example is from Georgia. There's 73 different counties in Georgia, and it shows in 2004, only one county, highlighted in red, was identified to have Roundup resistant Palmer amaranth pigweed. So the weeds growing that the Roundup was no longer killing, which was a real problem for the cotton crop. By 2005, just a year later, this had spread, the weeds had spread to 2 counties, a year later to 7 counties, sort of that teal blue, by 2007 to 11 counties, and so on, so that by 2011, in just 7 years, this Roundup resistant weed had spread from 1 county to 73. It's basically sort of an arms race between chemicals and super weeds. We'll keep creating new chemicals, but new weeds will continue to evolve to become resistant. In the use of herbicide-resistant crops in the U.S. is high. I looked this up just a few weeks ago. This is as of 2018. The green shows soybeans, blue, cotton, yellow, corn, and it shows how much of our acreage is planted to herbicide-tolerant seeds, Roundup Ready sort of seeds, if you will. And it's around 90–95%, so almost all. One of the reasons this sort of plateaued is there's not really anything else left to plant with it. We've pretty much planted all our acreage with herbicide-resistant GMOs. And we're having problems. Again, these herbicide-resistant weed populations keep popping up. So the industry's answer is that's okay. We'll just provide new crops, new hybrid seeds with different abilities that are resistant to other types of chemicals that we'll create. And of course, you'll be able to buy the seed and the chemical that goes with it directly from us. Opponents, others would say, in the race, there's other ways we can be doing this. Use agroecology methods, for example. And so in relation to Roundup Ready cotton, one alternative to using herbicides is rye planting. The way that this works is you use a cover crop, in this case rye, to block out the weeds instead of spraying chemicals to kill the weeds. And so there was a test conducted where they planted rye in between cotton and soybean rows in the fall, just before the leaf drop. They were doing it actually for soil cover. The researchers discovered after the harvest, though, that the rye wasn't just covering the ground, it was also covering the weed seeds. The rye prevents the seeds particularly the amaranth, the pigweed, from getting the sunlight they need to germinate. And so when the rye falls down or you chemically burn it down after growing it, it lays down flat and serves as a shield. It prevents sunlight from getting through to the weed seeds. This prevents germination up to about 85%. It works as well as pretty much any weed killer. Pigweed just hates rye. And so the system would be grow a crop of rye, then roll it flat to keep the weeds from growing, but leave some narrow gaps in it, and that's where you plant your cotton or whatever you're growing. And a rye cover crop has two other big benefits. It also prevents wind erosion, soil erosion from cover cropping, and the decomposition of the rye cover crop puts valuable vegetative matter back into the soil, increasing the fertility. And so it could be an important alternative strategy. Instead of creating new chemicals and new GMOs and continuing the arms race, use agroecology methods like cover cropping. Work with what nature, evolution, has already figured out over billions of years and imitate that, mimic it, mimic your agriculture off of ecological principles found in nature. And so this is a strategy from agroecology, cover cropping. And the idea again is to work with nature, not against it. So the agro refers to agriculture, ecology, ecological systems, and it's all about using ecological principles, how things work in nature, and then applying that towards agriculture, towards farming systems. And agroecology, it's not any one system like organic or intensive or extensive. It's different techniques that are sort of based in nature. Some examples of what I'm talking about of agroecology. Crop rotations. So you incorporate temporal diversity into the different plants you're planting each season. You rotate the crops. So this adds different nutrients into the soil, and it also breaks up cycles of pests and diseases that have an easy time sticking around if you're always planting the exact same species in the same spot year round. So you rotate, plant some corn and then plant soybeans and then plant corn. This helps fertilize the soil and also breaks up these cycles of pests and diseases. Polycultures. This is when you plant more than one crop. You plant two or several different crop species sufficiently close enough together to result in complementation or competition. And so the different plants growing in the same soil, they complement each other in the sense that they're all adding different nutrients in, creating fertility. And they also compete with each other for sunlight and other available resources, which increases overall yield. Agroforestry systems. So plant trees together with your annual crops or your animals and allow these different components of the ecosystem to complement one another. Crops don't need full sunlight, so they can be planted under trees. They'll still grow just as well. Plus, it breaks up the field so that you don't have the same exact stand of one crop in the same place all the time. It's more diverse, is naturally more resilient. And animals also eating the grass that's grown from the sun, defecating the animal manure, then fertilizing the grass and other plants, which allow them to grow and capture more sunlight, thus creating more biomass and more grass to feed the animals. So integrate these different aspects together. Cover crops, another strategy in agroecology. We just talked about this, the rye cover crop. Instead of using herbicides and other chemicals, use a rye cover crop. Not only do you eliminate the need for all these toxic chemicals, but it also has additional benefits. And animal integration, which I sort of touched on already, but allow the cows to actually graze on the grass. The sunlight is free, right? It grows the grass. The cows eat the grass. They defecate. Their manure fertilizes the grass further, allowing it to grow, to capture more sunlight, to feed more cows, and so on. It's sort of closed loop production. Everything is within the system is recycled. And so actually, you're going to watch an excellent example of alternatives. to industrial food production. And this example comes from Polyface Farms. You actually already met the guy that runs Polyface Farms. His name's Joel Saladin. He's in Food Inc. that we watched. He's sort of, well, you'll see in just a sec, but he's the one that has sort of a pastoral farming system. And so it requires people, warm bodies, and sort of working with nature rather than the industrial system. So what I want you to do is pause this lecture and then either copy and paste or type the URL for this clip into your browser and watch it. Unfortunately, I can't post other YouTube videos into my YouTube video. And so until I figure out a different way for doing this, this is how we're going to do it. So just kind of bear with me and I appreciate it. And we're going to watch 3 different clips. I'm almost done talking, but we are going to watch 3 different clips. And so at each point, pause the lecture, go watch the clip, and then come back to the lecture. They're really good. You don't want to skip them. This one's about 4 or 5 minutes. So go ahead, take a look at the clip, and then come back and resume the lecture, and we'll talk about it. So hopefully you just watched the clip on Polyface Farms. It's a great example of alternative ways we could be farming. One reason that it's not done this way, how Joel Saladin does it, is the scale of production can't be as large. The profit margins basically can't be as large. So let's just do a brief comparison between industrial agriculture and polyface farms. First of all, industrial methods for farming, it's a factory model with massive outputs, tons of yield that requires huge chemical and fossil fuel inputs. It's a factory versus a farm. In contrast, pastoral methods, this is related to letting animals graze on the natural land, the grass, use the natural occurring vegetation to feed the animals, who will then feed the grass by producing manure, then grows the grass, captures more sunlight, feeds the cows, and so on. It takes virtually no non-human inputs or chemicals or fossil fuels, just humans to move the animals, to rotate them. You also don't get any of the byproducts, the pollution, the eutrophication, the toxic runoff, the soil degradation that you do with industrial farming. Industrial ag uses annual species. Seeds you plant and grow for one season, and then they die, and then you have to repurchase the seed. Perennials, in contrast, regrow every spring. You don't have to buy more seed or replant them. And interestingly, the difference between an annual and a perennial is genetic. And there's a clever plant gene technique that can be used to actually change any annual into a perennial. Why don't we do this? Why don't people do this? If people had perennial seeds, then they wouldn't have to buy new seeds from Monsanto and other large companies every year. Profit motive. Industrial ags based off monoculture. Plant one crop year-round. It results in high yields, but huge social and environmental costs. Depleted soil, chemical inputs, runoff, and also it becomes vulnerable to climate fluctuations or market fluctuations. So if you're growing just one crop and something goes wrong in your field, you're out of luck. That entire species is going to be vulnerable. If you're growing just one crop and the price on the market collapses, you're out of luck. With polyculture, you plant and grow multiple crops. It's more diverse and resilient. And also, it makes the farmer more resilient, so that if one crop falls through on the market or doesn't do well that season, the farm's diversified. They have other crops or commodities to rely on. Industrial ag uses fossil fuel energy, lots of non-human energy inputs to keep plants growing on this continually depleted soil. It's polluting, it's wasteful, it doesn't seem to be sustainable in the long run, but time will tell. In contrast, polyface farms and pastoral systems use solar energy, which is renewable, right? Capture it. the main difference being, right, the scale of production might not be as large, right? You don't have this vast sort of stored energy source that we do with fossil fuel, which is basically stored energy. And industrial agriculture produces for the global market. The scale of production is huge, and the system is driven and structured according to profits. Thus, whatever is most profitable is what's done, and this is unfortunately also not what is best for the environment or social equality. Remember in Food Inc., ICE, immigration services in the U.S., immigration enforcement in the U.S. had a deal with the production company Smithfield, where they would come in and arrest undocumented workers, but only 15%, only 15 workers per day, or 15% of the production line, so that ICE was still deporting people, but not enough people to mess with Smithfield's production line, right? So they can continue to produce our cheap holiday hams and whatnot. So the global market sort of allows for this. It allows for these externalized costs. It's all about profit on the market and doing whatever's cheapest. This is in contrast to producing for the local market, right? You're probably focused less on profit. You aren't using as much energy. It might cost a little more, the stuff you're selling, but it'll be healthier. It'll be more sustainable. It'll usually taste better, be more ripe because it's local. Industrial ag specialized, focus on one or two crops for the market. Again, this makes them vulnerable both to ecological and market fluctuations. Pastoral systems are diversified. If one crop fails or the market price drops, there's others to fall back on. Industrial ag uses mechanical energy. It's all tractors and spraying chemicals. Very little human labor is needed. And one of the results is unemployment in farming communities. This is in contrast to pastoral. It uses biological energy, human bodies, human energy inputs. This creates jobs. It also precludes the pollution and the energy waste that comes with using mechanical energy and mechanical inputs. And lastly, industrial ag uses imported fertility, fossil fuels, fertilizer, which is not only wasteful and degrading, but not renewable. In contrast to local fertility, use the sun and the local biomass to capture that sunlight, to feed the animals, to fertilize the soil, who will then defecate, recontribute to the soil, which can then capture more sunlight and grow more biomass. Another alternative to industrial food production comes from a group called the Greenhorns. And so it's a nationwide organization of young or new US farmers, basically. And their goal is, because of this sort of crisis in American agriculture in the last several decades, where we have fewer farmers, less land, a degraded soil base, and intensifying corporate control over our food system. It's about people sort of taking farming into their own hands and coming up with new ways of producing food for themselves. So the clip's about 3 to 4 minutes. Go ahead and copy and paste or type the URL into your browser and watch the clip of the Greenhorns. You can pause the lecture and then resume it after you've watched the clip. Okay, welcome back, and hopefully you watched the clip. One more example of different things different people are doing as alternatives. So in terms of small-scale agroecology, some conclusions. There's some evidence that plants grown this way through agroecology methods versus with chemicals and fertilizer are more nourishing than those grown in synthetically fertilized soils, but it's not conclusive evidence. Usually this type of food tastes better, it smells better, it's more it's picked at the peak of freshness and nutrition. A lot of other foods, when they're not produced locally and they come from foreign markets like bananas and pineapples from Hawaii or other places, they're picked when they're green, not ripe, transported maybe 3,000 miles to their destination, and then artificially ripened with ethylene gas. And fruit naturally releases ethylene gas to ripen. It's a natural process that happens. But when the fruit is ready to be fully matured, and so when you pick it before it's matured and ship it overseas and artificially ripen it with ethylene gas, um, it looks ripe. It might look like a really delicious apple, but it might not actually taste like one, right? Because it hasn't been allowed to mature into peak flavor, peak nutritional quality. It's been artificially ripened. On that note, foods grown in this type of soil usually taste better. Plants grown this way are less prone to disease and index. Again, agroecology methods reflect more diversified ecosystems in contrast to monocropping. And this type of agriculture can be quite productive. It can be equally productive or even more productive than industrial farming in terms of how much energy you're putting in and how much food you're getting out. Again, one of the reasons industrial agriculture is actually really inefficient once you account for all the non-human energy inputs, the fossil fuels and the chemicals. So the big question, why isn't there more research into agroecology from private companies, seeing as this could be a major solution to any food problems we might have? And the answer essentially is because you can't patent these techniques, right? You can't patent them as your own intellectual property and therefore make profits off them. And so there's not a huge incentive for businesses to do more research into them. Can small scale agroecology feed the world? Yeah, we could definitely be doing things different. A lot of places around the world already do things much differently than we do. A couple of things Poland says, though, or results in general, is we would need to eat less meat, right? Remember, meat is really consumptive. 90% of the energy that goes into growing the animal is lost just through trophic levels. Um, we'd need to eat locally grown foods at least a lot more often, so that all that food is not being transported via fossil fuels thousands and thousands of miles. We would need to give more control to the farmers over the farm bill and the policies that structure the way they run their businesses and sell their farm products. It's not really controlled by the farmers right now. The farm bill is controlled by elites, political and economic elites. We would also need to change government policy, change the farm bill, change the incentives, create policies that promote agroecology, that incentivize and subsidize these types of methods rather than industrial ag growing a few cheap commodities for enormous profits for a handful of people. Change the policy. This would result in healthier people and healthier farmlands. How does this happen, right? One, start at home. Eat local, support local businesses, go to the farmer's market, plant a garden, plant some plants in your yard, right? Make the soil healthier in your own little area. A couple of my own tips, I've taken up gardening recently. Coffee grounds. Coffee grounds, if you're a coffee drinker, excellent source of nitrogen, which is basically what fertilizer is. Take your coffee grounds, sprinkle them on your plants. If you don't have plants, put them on your fucking neighbor's plants. I don't care. Put them on your landlord's plants. Who cares? You're creating fertility. You're healing the land. Coffee grounds is a great one. Nitrogen's important. Carbon is also important in plant growth. Ashes. Any type of burnt plant material, burnt into ash, you can incorporate that ash into the soil. This is what they do with slash and burn agriculture. And it levels out the pH, makes the soil less acidic, adds carbon and other valuable material back into the soil for plant growth. All you pot smokers out there, that's what you can do with your ashes. Put them in the soil. Another suggestion, compost. Compost. Okay, I think actually that's the end of my suggestions. Anyways, there's stuff you can do as an individual, but even more importantly, individual actions matter, but even more importantly, we have to change the larger structural barriers, the way the system is set up. We need to get involved, vote, and change policy. The first priority needs to be changing U.S. Farm Bill policies so that they support farmers, support healthy food, support people, support the environment, rather than just supporting a handful of wealthy individuals. One last reading you had from Michael Pollan was this short one-page article from Time Magazine, 6 Rules for Eating Wisely. And so what Pollan says is eat food, not food products, right? If you can't sort of pull it out of the ground, think about what's actually in it. Don't eat anything your grandma wouldn't recognize as food, like xanthan gum, for example, or all those other ingredients that you can't pronounce on the back of the label. If you're going to eat butter, not margarine. Avoid high fructose corn syrup. Unfortunately, this doesn't just mean cakes and cookies, but also soups and salads and ketchup and a whole bunch of other food products that we consume. The average American consumes 40 pounds of high fructose corn syrup a year. That's in addition to all the sugars that we already ate pre 1975, pre the invention of high fructose corn syrup. Avoid processed foods. Eat real food, not food products or creations. Second, Poland says spend more and eat less. We spend less than any other nation on food, less than 10% of our income as Americans, but also as a nation, we spend more on healthcare than any other nation. Coincidence? Cheap food's making us sick. If we have healthier food, it might cost a little more because of the cost of production of that food. It's not being subsidized, but we'll end up with healthier people that feel better and need to eat less because what they're eating is actually nutritious, more nutritious. Ignore nutritional science or health claims on packages. Food pyramids, all that bullshit put out by the FDA, be wary about that. Is that really designed with your health in mind, or are other things coming into play? Especially given most of these marketing tricks are designed to catch your eye and they don't really say anything about the product. For example, a water bottle that says gluten-free or GMO-free. Of course, it already doesn't have gluten in it. It's a bottle of water. So a lot of those health claims on packages, it doesn't actually even tell you anything about the product. It's probably might not even be relevant to the product, but it catches your eye, makes you feel good about your decision, makes you feel healthy about it, has that added value Poland's talking about. Shop at the farmer's market. You'll end up eating foods that are in season, which means they'll be at peak flavor and nutritional quality. You'll also be supporting local farmers, preventing all that waste on imported food transportation, among other things. And lastly, Poland sort of says how you eat is as important as what you eat. So you shouldn't eat alone. I don't know. I eat alone. I think his point is, think about it, enjoy it, savor it. It's not just sort of a chore or something to rush through or fill your time with. Eat your food with others if you can. You can still watch TV. The last thing we'll talk about in relation to industrial food production is something called food deserts. So what are food deserts? They are places with liquor stores, with fast food restaurants like this walk-through Jack in the Box on the slide, and no real actual food for miles. So even if people want to eat healthier, they may not have access where they live to healthy food. There's even Vaughn's here in San Diego has different tiers, and depending on the affluence of the neighborhood, they provide more or less organics, more or less healthy food. The more affluent neighborhoods have higher tiered Vaughn's with more organics, more produce. Less wealthy neighborhoods, opposite. It's a thing. Look it up. And so we're going to watch a TED Talk. It's the last thing we'll do by Ron Finley, a guerrilla gardener in South Central LA is the name of the TED Talk. And so go ahead and what you're going to do is you're going to copy and paste or type the link, the URL, into your browser and watch this TED Talk. It's about 12 minutes long, and it's about food deserts. It's a great way to sort of wrap up industrial food production. Before I let you go, because this will be the end of the lecture, and then you'll go watch the TED Talk to finish up the subject, let me just make a couple of quick announcements. This will be the end of our section on industrial food production and sustainability in industrial society. The next section of the course is sustainability across cultures and through time. So we'll be looking at various case studies of different cultures from different time periods in different places. And what can we learn from these societies? How have they interacted with their environment? How have they managed their resource base? Has it been sustainable or not? Um, Environmental degradation is not an inevitable result of human organization, of people. Rather, it's culturally specific. It's not set in stone, right? People created the system we're in today. People can change it. What can we learn from other cultures to better inform our own directions about sustainability? And so on Thursday, we'll be starting with this section with a case study on pre-industrial complex farming societies, namely the Maya. And you're going to be reading two articles about the Maya, which take sort of two different sides to the story of what happened to the Maya. Did they overshoot their environment and collapse, or did something else happen? And so you're going to be reading about that for the lecture that I'll post for you tomorrow on Thursday. And so with that, hey, we made it through our first online lecture. Hopefully it wasn't too painful for you this time. I'll be working on the format to try to make it flow a little more in terms of having the clips embedded in the recorded videos and whatnot for you. All that good stuff. So watch the TED Talk and have a good rest of your day. More to come on Thursday.